So it's been 20 years since the Rome Statute was established. How do you think that it has contributed so far to the global fight against impunity?
Well, first, I think it's exceedingly important for the international community to have a permanent court that's focused on ensuring that those who've committed the most heinous atrocities are brought to justice. So from a principal point of view, I think that's absolutely crucial. The complexities deal with whether or not an international permanent court can function in an international setting where in fact you don't have all countries behind it. There are some key countries that are not members of the court, so there's already a weakness there. And you have to have this type of international support for a court, this particular court, to be successful. So I think generally you will have some mixed some mixed assessment on the court 20 years on. There'll be those who will criticize the court for having spent too much money, not securing sufficient number of convictions. All of that is probably true. But going back to the fundamental question of whether or not the international community should take a stand against impunity and in support of accountability for the most heinous crimes, the answer surely is yes, and therefore the International Court has a role to play.
And we have seen some significant convictions. In 2016, for example, we had the conviction of Hossein Habre, the Chaldean dictator, for a number of crimes. How significant are convictions like these, and what message does this send that the court is actually working and doing its job?
Well, I mean, ultimately I look at this court as I would any court, through the lens of international justice, accountability, and fairness. And I remember the first time I ever met with Justice Richard Goldstone, who was the prosecutor for the International Court for the Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia. And on the first case, the Tadic case, I essentially asked him the same thing, and he said, the yardstick measurement will not be whether Mr. Tadic is convicted, but whether he's perceived to have had a fair trial. I thought that was quite remarkable for the prosecutor to focus on that issue. And so for me, the convictions, although important, is not as crucial as whether or not we have a international justice component through the International Criminal Court that is there to ensure that individuals are brought to justice. Sometimes you'll get a conviction, sometimes you don't. I feel that if you have a fair trial, that's in essence what's going to happen. You'll win some, you'll lose some. But ultimately, it's important to bring these individuals to justice. And of course, convictions based on solid evidence, overwhelming evidence, then it does send a very strong message to the international community that individuals will be held accountable, if not today, tomorrow, if not tomorrow, then in the future. There's no statute of limitations for these types of crimes, and that too is a very important position that the court has, and a very important message.
And it's interesting you focus on this idea of a fair trial, obviously such an important aspect of the court. And we had this recent overturning the decision of the Jean-Pierre Bemba conviction, which obviously, as you've mentioned, a lot of people have criticised the court for this. What do you think, though, that it says about the court's commitment to giving people a fair trial?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that is very complicated, because I've now read the appeals judgment on it. I'm not a big fan of it. I think there are weaknesses to it. I thought it was unfortunate that the appeals court made the determination that the entire case, in essence, had no validity to it, rather than perhaps indicate areas where they needed to be a retry on this. But this is part of the process. This is part of a legal process where you have the right to appeal. Separate judges will review the work of the trial chamber and make a decision. And this is what happened. It's not the best situation for the office of the prosecutor at all. And I think she even went in an unprecedented way to express her frustration on this. But the fact is, we move on, and there'll be other cases, there'll be other situations that arise, and I think it's important for the international community, even under these frustrating moments, to maintain full support for this court.
Yes, exactly. And as you mentioned a little bit earlier, also the court often gets criticised for not intervening in certain situations, but it is limited by its jurisdiction. It doesn't have jurisdiction in countries, for example, like Syria, and it is being criticised a lot for not intervening. What can happen, or does the mandate of the court and its jurisdictions need to be broadened?
Well, I think one of the real again, challenges for the court and for the international community is the structure of the court. Let's remember that this court doesn't have a police force, it doesn't have an army. If it makes a decision, it depends, it relies on the international community, states, to implement the decisions of the court. This can be seen as a real fundamental weakness because, as you've indicated, there are a number of states, very powerful states, the United States, Israel, Russia, who simply do not recognize the jurisdiction of the court. So they will never provide substantial support, even to the point of not enforcing the decisions of the court. So that's a weakness right there. But more than anything else in the 20 years, I think we've seen a pattern that I think is quite disturbing, and that is that even state parties to the Rome Statute, those states who are members of the court in essence, have failed to abide by the court's decisions. And this is really seen in for the al-Bashir case in Sudan, President al-Bashir, who now was indicted years ago, and yet freely wanders the world, including into countries that are members of the court, and he does so with impunity. Now, some can look at the court and say, well, what's happening here? And the court would simply say, well, this is no longer our responsibility. We've done our job. It's now the international community's job to do. In the same way, the UN Security Council, who has the authority to refer cases to the court, it has done so on a number of occasions, and then in essence it steps back and doesn't really help the court in enforcing those, the decision to refer. That is a real frustrating aspect of international justice, in my opinion, and it has nothing to do with the court. The court's not responsible for that, shouldn't be faulted for that, shouldn't be criticized for that. The eyes should be back on the international community and on the UN Security Council for their failure to provide sufficient support for the court. This, to me, is the greatest challenge, and this is what we need to focus on in the next 20 years.
And who can put that pressure, do you think, on the international community and the UN Security Council to have a greater push in this area?
Well, I think states have to be more cognizant of their role in supporting the court. That's one. I think people should speak out. Citizens need to speak out if they're frustrated at times with the lack of vigorous by the court. If they look a bit deeper, it's often because the international community, or specifically UN Security Council, have not provided that type of support. I think we need to recognize first and foremost that if international justice is to work and to function and to be effective, it is not the sole responsibility for the International Criminal Court to do that. All of us have to do that. The entire international community. So if we want international justice to mean something, if we want accountability to trump impunity, then we have to be more aggressive in supporting the court. That's where I would be pushing for.